Hey guys, I'm Fanciful Devices, also known as Marina, and today we're going to take a tin like this and turn it into something awesome.
The key to my success is the shop I discovered on Etsy called Decorative Decals. Now they're in the UK, so it will take about a week and a half, 2 weeks for them to arrive, but it's well worth it because these are so lovely and they're so inexpensive. If you can even find Mayor cord decals, they could be like $20 for just a sheet, so you don't want to waste them, you don't want to mess them up. But with these, you don't have to worry about that. Also, Mayor cord use clear plastic backing that creates like a halo all around your image, makes it look almost like a sticker. These don't have that, except for the eyes and the doll faces that they sell. These are just the image itself. So when you're done, it looks like the image was painted on your tin. So you're getting original vintage decals directly from the factory that made them. It's pretty cool. To break down your tin, you'll need a can opener, some serrated edge tin snips like these that I got from the hardware store. I much prefer these mini snips by Tim Holtz. You'll also need a pair of non-serrated edge snips like these Fiskars tin snips, although if you don't have these, it's actually possible to just use regular scissors. Here I'm using scissors I bought in IKEA. This tin is quite strong, but it's also very thin, unlike some vintage tin, which is a lot thicker. So I think regular scissors work just fine. Here I'm taking apart my tin like a big can, and anywhere the bottom won't come loose, I just use my snips. Here I'm removing the seams anywhere that the tin is folded or creased. I'm cutting in half to make it easier to work with, and then I'm cutting off all the seams. And notice I'm folding those edges back away from my hands to avoid any scratches or scrapes. Of course, you're welcome to use protective gloves. You'll notice a lot of rusty bits. Don't worry about those. Those are going to come right off in the next step. I'm cutting these in thirds and then here in half to make it easier to hold with my pliers over the fire to get rid of all the paint and print and get a nice vintage looking patina. Notice the green flames? That's all the paint burning off. And once the green flame is gone, you're done. And then you can quickly run it under some water so you can handle it again right away. I'm doing the same thing to the large bottom piece. And of course you're welcome to cut it in half or in quarters to make it easier to handle. Move it all around to get all the different areas. And here you can see the rust is quite flat under my fingers. It's all coming right off. And here are my results. Now when you start cutting your pieces, here I'm making a bracelet connector. You can draw on it like here, or you can even make yourself some paper templates. I honestly never do. This is the most I've ever done. I usually just go straight with the scissors. That little rectangle that was left over, I'm just cutting it diagonally, and this is how I cut most of my earring charms, diagonally into triangles. And as I cut all the little sharp bits off and all the extra bits, notice how my finger holds that piece to keep it from flying off. These are really sharp bits that are produced here, and they will dig into your flesh. If here I am with my non-serrated edge, holding all the little trim bits, try to make it as smooth as possible to save myself from a lot of sanding that I'm going to have to do afterwards. And it's just time to chill and sand. Here you can see I'm making a little C shape to make sure that all the sides of the edge, the top, the bottom, and the straight on flat side, all those sides are smooth. Here it is before any sanding. It's kind of hard to see on the video, but it's pretty bumpy. Here it is after. You can sand more if you need to as you do the next steps. Here I'm measuring a cuff bracelet, cutting freehand. This time I'm cutting straight with my non-serrated edge and not doing the rough cut first. Rounding out those corners and holding those little bits before they go flying. You'll notice that my corners aren't perfectly symmetrical, but they're pretty close. Here I'm cutting 2 strips to make into hoop earrings. So there's a lot of things you could do with this tin. And again, I'm just carefully eyeballing everything. Here, this piece, I think, how about a ring? So I measured it with my eyes, and then this little leftover piece, don't throw that out. You can cut it diagonally for earring charms. Now I'm breaking down the large bottom piece, as you can see with my serrated edge, and I'm cutting it into fourths, and I'm going to cut some wedges. But if you do want matching things, you just put them together and measure them against each other, like I'm doing here, flipping one piece or the other to make sure that they all line up every side. And then I'm doing my fine cutting and then sanding everything smooth. When you shape your pieces, start just using your hands like I'm doing here. Now some tin is really quite brittle, like this new tin. So it folds itself. Do you see those big facets that appear? They're like little folds that form on their own. Instead of trying to avoid these, I'm going to increase them by holding my plier and then pushing just a little bit with my thumb right next to the plier, and that makes even more folds, which produces this really cool texture. Notice how I'm tilting the pliers so that not all my folds are perfectly parallel. I really like that as well. And as I add these little folds, I'm also, surprisingly enough, work hardening the tin, as well as really over curving it. Next, I'll open it up until I have a shape that I like. I also look at the edge head on and flatten any wonky folds or any parts that bend too suddenly, and then I'm ready to pierce my holes. I like to swivel the piece around a little to get any hanging bit of metal. Here I'm doing something similar with the hoop earring pieces, and right away they are sort of becoming faceted. I added more folds between each of those facets that showed up. Here folded and there not. And once again, I pierce. Here I'm smoothing it a little bit, and I'm looking straight on at that edge to see if any part looks imperfect, making sure it's a good circle. Now I'm shaping a triangular earring charm, and notice I give a lot of attention to the edges, and then I use a wooden paintbrush as a sort of mandrel. That will give me like a tube shape, but I want more of a triangle, so I fold the tip in more and then flare the bottom out. Be careful about your hole placement too. Make sure to look at it from every angle. This piece I'm shaping without curling it quite as much as my previous pieces. So notice I pay a lot of attention to the edges. I tuck those in, and right away that gives the piece a bit of life and dimension. Now I'm going to give it like a soft curve and try to get it to puff out. Look how I'm bending it from corner to corner, sort of diagonally, to give it more of just a little puff and not curl. Again, I'm going back to my edges. Those are really important. And then piercing as usual. Now this piece I decided was too big, so no problem. I just cut it into two, shaped the cut edge a little, and I get these great little wedge pieces, which I quite like. Here we have the perfect piece for forming into a cone. Notice there's just a lot of fussing and a lot of focus on those two edges because they have to meet. I'm curving it little by little. Here I have serrated pliers that help me really grip it and push the center inward. I also have these really giant serrated edge pliers with which I make sure those edges line up. Although you don't have to have these. I decided that these are huge and look like those icing decorative tips. So again, no problem. I'm just going to cut out slices and use the first one to eyeball the second one, smoothing out the shape that you just cut, and then sanding everything smooth. And then you keep making your cone just smaller, like I'm doing here. And I'm pushing especially that center bit together. Tin works best with just a ton of little pushes and bends and curves and corrections. So here we have them. Finally, it's time to play with my favorite bits, the decals. That's the back. They come with a protective tissue over the top. What you see here is the bottom, the side that's going to be stuck against the tin. That's why you can't see it very well. You're going to need to pull off that backing paper. Don't pull at the tissue or your decal will curl and be much harder to handle. It's still going to curl a little bit, look. So you really have to remember not to pull at the tissue, but to pull at that backing paper. Oh, I love that one. See here, I'm doing it again, and I'm really pulling at the paper this time flat. So that paper really curled, and this tissue paper is pretty flat. Here I'm doing it for my little deer. How cute are they? And I'm cutting out 2 deer. And to face those deer, I selected these little squirrels because the deer only come facing one direction, and you need, for earrings, you kind of need them to face each other. I'm cutting off all the extra tissue so I can really see where I'm going to place my decals on my tin. And now I'm choosing which tin. Those little wedges are really good for this. And once I have my placement perfect, move those out of the way, please don't get those wet. It's just a matter of wetting the tissue and pressing a good seal between the decal and the tin. And with that, the tissue will slide right off. Oh my gosh, perfect. Oh, before you touch the rest, make sure to dry your hands. Be very careful to dry your hands between placing one decal and another. It's a mistake I always make, but you'll learn soon enough. And I press until it slides right off. Here I'm cutting out some butterflies for a ring. I decided to put a bunch of little butterflies all around it. Again, I just tap some water on there. Now these butterfly decals are really thick compared to all the other decals, and I think they're quite new because see this edge, it barely even folds over. So I'll worry about that edge later when it's dry. By the way, whenever you're removing your tissue, always pull it off, never lift it off, or you'll lift off or up bits of the image on the more fragile decals. And here's why you shouldn't mess with the edges until the whole thing is dry and cured and set. I'm trying to use an X-Acto knife here, and as you can see, it's pulling the entire decal right off. So just let it dry in peace, and we'll focus on that bit later. Here we have our giant rose, and with it we're gonna decorate our really big pieces like this cup, which I haven't shaped yet. That might work. And if I place them like this, I'll get a bit of rose for each of my scallop earring pieces. So I should have really given myself a little leeway and not cut it so exact to the cuff. I'm going to grab a snippet of rose for each semicircle, and then it folds really easy to provide a guide for cutting. And this time I cut, giving myself just a tiny bit of leeway for placement, as you can see here. And on this one, I'm going to add greenery from different parts of the picture. I think those look great. Be careful when you're putting a very large decal like this, because you need to make sure every bit of the image is pressed. Found a tiny leaf that I cut in half, and I figured I'd place one on each earring since I had room and I don't like to waste anything. So that's just more detail for my earrings. There's these big wedges that I'm gonna decorate with the little orange flowers at either end of this decal I've been using. And I'm cutting very carefully, and then I do a lot of fussing and moving things around to figure out the best placement. Any extra that comes off of the edge of the tin, I cut off and save it for later. I put my thumb right on top of a freshly applied decal, and as you can see here, it flipped up. So be really careful when you're making these multi-part compositions to only hold the edge of the tin, like I'm now doing correctly. That little extra bit I'm going to use to fill some blanks in my image, just like so. And I have to do the next one. Don't worry about perfect symmetry. Looks good. Now I'm carefully fine cutting. I'm putting this orange flower on this rather large tall wedge. I'm going to include this red flower as well to combine with my orange flower, like so. You can just buy larger decals if you want to make large earring pieces, but you don't want to have to fuss as much as I am with composition. I kind of like doing this. Here I'm cutting out my very favorite flower, this bluish odd thing, to put on my cones. And finally, last wedges will be these. These are the most fragile of all the decals that I've tried. I'm folding to make some cutting guides for myself. I really like these images. And be extra careful if you do any really big pieces like this, because the bigger they are, the easier it is to mess up. Make sure you press every last little millimeter in there. Leave everything out to dry for at least, I would say, 3 hours. I've tried to dry it with a heat gun and that just shrivels up the decal right away, so it has to dry on its own completely. These are the things that I use as a sealant. I have Mod Podge, I have a decoupage glue in the middle here, and then my favorite is this golden polymer varnish because it produces the most matte finish of all. But as you can see, a wide variety of things will work. I'm adding this protective finish because after this step, I'm going to make everything look more vintage by tinting it with a little bit of alcohol ink. And the alcohol in the ink can really ruin the decal. It can sort of disintegrate it. I'm fixing this ring, these edges, with a little bit of sandpaper. The color I'm using is called Pebble, and I really like it because it's a nice light gray. Dip a little bit on my finger and then just spread it out until it gets a little sticky and sort of sets on there. Dip a little bit on my finger and then smear it all over. I'm pretty confident, so a lot of times I'll just put the ink directly on the image and rub it all over, like so. And I know you're going, oh, but you're losing so much detail. Now, here are two that I've inked and two that I haven't. And you can see that while the ones I haven't have more detail, they also have a more juvenile sort of 70s look to them. The ones that have been inked don't look 70s, they look maybe 40s or 50s and have a much softer, less obnoxious look. Now these birds are already pretty soft looking and vintage looking, so I put less. These butterflies are really bright and don't have a lot of details, so I put a lot of ink on there to make it look vintage. And continue. One thing that doesn't need tinting is anything from this long decal, except for these bright yellow ones at the edge, which, as you can see here, I did tint. All the other ones have so much richness and vintage detail that they don't need it. If you remember these hoops from before, I decorated them with the roses that come in strips. I did the outside first and sealed it, let it all dry before doing the inside. Now I'm using an alcohol ink fillable pen just to darken the white bits as an experiment to see how it looks. You don't have to worry too much about getting alcohol ink all over your fingers. As long as you put any kind of oil on them and then scrub them, you can use a scrubby, I'm showing you here with my fingernail, that the oil sort of picks up most of that alcohol ink. And then you can wash off the oil and the ink with soap and water. Once your alcohol ink dries on your pieces in just a few minutes, it looks super shiny, so we need another matte layer. After that dries, you can take a little poker tool and re-pierce any of the holes that have gotten clogged up. Now my big pieces on the back, I decided to add some gold leafing because there's a lot of surface that you're going to be able to see, and I'm putting way too much of the size that sticks the gold leaf on right now. So don't do it like this, put just a lot less, and then just set it aside to dry until it's transparent for about 15 minutes. This is after 10. Here is the gold leaf I like it, and it's not real gold, but you can get it in this variegated pattern, so I like that. And I just press my pieces down onto it, then fold the paper back over and pull them up and sort of tamp everything down and burnish. Directly after, you should seal your pieces to protect that gold from getting oxidized or scratched, and to cover up all that size so your pieces are no longer sticky. Because I used too much size, everything got sticky, and on the front I ended up with little bits of gold sort of sprinkled over the piece, which I think looked pretty cute. But if I didn't want it, I could just leave these unsealed, and in about a couple weeks all this gold would oxidize, turn dark, and sort of visually recede. You wouldn't be able to see it anymore. I ended up with a couple air bubbles, so I'm gonna take care of those, sealing over that. And this will protect my gold bits from getting oxidized. I'm trying to find beads that might match with my results, or here I'm considering a little loop of sunstone rondelles with these wedges. These little guys I could also hang inside of a hoop of some kind, or below a hoop. So there's a lot of different options. Don't limit yourself. On these semicircles, I extended the shape by adding this really big sterling silver ear wire, though of course you can use brass or whatever wire you like. Here's how I ended up painting these hoops with the darker tinting on the outside edge. Now I just need some rings, maybe sterling silver. Small hoop rings would do nicely. All of these came from just that one tin I showed you at the beginning with not even a top on it. So imagine everything you'll be able to make.